The hum is constant, deep, mechanical. It comes from somewhere below, through iron and wood, and the hydraulic ram buried in the shaft beneath your feet. You're standing on a platform 8 feet wide, surrounded by wooden crates stamped with shipping marks from Chicago and Detroit. The ceiling is open slats. Above you, dusty light filters down from the fourth-floor loading bay. The elevator rises. It's 1894. The warehouse is 5 stories tall, brick and timber, built to store cotton bales and machinery parts near the rail depot. This freight elevator is one of 3 in the building, hydraulic, direct acting. A piston pushes up from below, lifting the platform on a column of pressurized water fed by a coal-fired pump in the basement. You pass the 2nd floor. The gate slides by iron mesh, painted green. A worker glances over, doesn't wave. The hum continues, smooth, predictable 3rd floor. The light changes, cooler now. The air smells like linseed oil and dust. You can hear the pressure valves clicking somewhere in the walls. Everything is normal. Then you pass the 4th floor. The platform keeps rising. It should stop here. This is where the foreman told you to unload. But the mechanism doesn't respond. The hum remains steady. You're still moving. And then, between the 4th and 5th floors, the elevator begins to slow. Not suddenly. Not with the lurch of a failed brake or snapped cable. It slows the way a boat slows when the wind dies. Gradually, gently. As if the machine has decided on its own that it's gone far enough. You look up. The 5th floor is 12 feet above you. You can see the edge of the loading platform, the iron rail, the open doorway. The hum is still there. The pressure gauge on the wall, mounted in a brass housing near the gate, shows 70 pounds per square inch. Normal operating range. But the elevator has stopped rising. You wait. 30 seconds. A minute. The platform doesn't move. It doesn't drop. It simply hovers, suspended in the shaft, as if caught on something invisible. You can hear the pump still running below. The hum hasn't changed. But the elevator will not climb. Eventually, someone on the 5th floor lowers a rope. You tie off the cargo and it's hauled up manually. Then the platform is lowered, smoothly, without incident, and you step off on the ground floor. No alarms were triggered. No cables were damaged. No one can explain what just happened. But 3 days later, it happens again. The first time, they assumed it was operator error. Someone had released the control valve too early, or the pressure hadn't built up fully before the ascent. But the second time, the operator was Samuel Voss, a man who'd been running hydraulic lifts for 6 years. He knew the system. He'd checked the gauges before starting the lift. He'd done everything correctly. Voss had loaded the platform with 4 barrels of machine oil, each weighing 200 pounds. Standard load. He engaged the valve, felt the platform begin to rise, and watched the pressure gauge climb to 70 pounds. The elevator passed the 2nd floor, then the 3rd. Then it slowed, just as it had before, and stopped 8 feet below the 5th floor landing. Voss waited. He cycled the valve. He checked the pressure line for leaks. Nothing. The pump was running. The fluid was pressurized. The platform simply would not rise. 2 workers were sent down from the 5th floor with a hand winch. They hauled the barrels up one at a time while Voss stood on the platform, staring at the gauge. When the platform was empty, he lowered it back to the ground floor. It descended without issue. The warehouse foreman, a man named Calloway, filed a maintenance report. He noted the load weight, the operator, the temperature that day, 62 degrees, and the fact that no mechanical damage was observed. He sent the report to the building's owner, who forwarded it to the contracting firm that had installed the elevator 3 years earlier. The firm sent an inspector. His name was Thomas Grid. He arrived on a Thursday morning in October, carrying a leather valise and a notebook. He spent 4 hours examining the system. He checked the piston rod for scoring. He inspected the packing glands for leaks. He tested the pressure relief valves and confirmed they were seated properly. He measured the fluid level in the accumulator tank and found it adequate. He found nothing wrong, Grid wrote in his report. System components in good working order. No mechanical defect observed. Recommend continued monitoring. But the problem didn't stop. Over the next 2 weeks, the elevator stopped short of the 5th floor 6 more times. Sometimes it stopped 9 feet below, sometimes 7. Once it stopped only 3 feet short, close enough that a worker could step directly onto the landing. But it never reached the top on its own. And then, without warning, it did. On November 4th, the elevator rose all the way to the 5th floor and stopped exactly where it should have. smooth, perfect, as if nothing had ever been wrong. They began keeping a log. Callaway ordered every operator to record the date, time, temperature, load weight, and outcome of each trip. The log was kept in a wooden box bolted to the wall near the ground floor gate. Operators were required to fill it out before and after every lift. What the log revealed was disturbing. The stoppages were inconsistent. Some days the elevator worked perfectly. Other days it stopped short, but never at the same height twice. On November 9th, it stopped 11 feet below the 5th floor. On November 12th, it stopped 4 feet below. On November 18th, it reached the top without issue. There was no pattern to the load weights. A full platform, 2,000 pounds, might reach the 5th floor on Monday and stop short on Tuesday. An empty platform might stop halfway on Wednesday and reach the top on Thursday. Temperature seemed to correlate loosely. Colder days saw more failures, but not always. On November 21st, the temperature was 48 degrees and the elevator worked flawlessly. On November 23rd, the temperature was 51 degrees and it stopped 9 feet short. The operators began to dread the 5th floor runs. It wasn't the stopping itself that unsettled them, it was the unpredictability. You could never be certain whether the platform would reach the top or strand you in the shaft. And when it did stop, there was no warning, no grinding, no loss of pressure. Just a slow, gentle deceleration, as if the elevator had reached an invisible ceiling. One operator, a man named Henriksen, described it this way. It's like the machine forgets where it's going. You can feel it slowing down, but there's nothing you can do. The valves open, the pumps running, but the platform just stops. By December, the warehouse had begun routing heavy loads to the other 2 elevators. The problematic lift was used only for light cargo, tools, small crates, single workers. But even then, it continued to fail. On December 9th, it stopped short while carrying only 1 man and a toolbox. On December 14th, it reached the top while carrying a full load of iron pipe. The log grew thicker. Callaway sent it to the building's owner, who forwarded it to the contracting firm. This time, they sent 2 engineers. A hydraulic freight elevator is a simple machine, conceptually at least. At the bottom of the shaft, buried in a cylindrical chamber lined with cast iron, is a vertical piston. The piston is 12 inches in diameter and extends upward through a series of packing glands, leather and rubber seals that prevent water from escaping as the piston rises. The top of the piston is bolted to the underside of the elevator platform. When the operator opens the control valve on the ground floor, pressurized water flows from an accumulator tank, a large iron cylinder located in the basement, into the chamber below the piston. The water pushes the piston upward. The piston pushes the platform upward. The platform rises. When the operator wants to descend, he closes the supply valve and opens a drain valve. Water flows out of the chamber, back into a reservoir. The piston lowers. The platform descends. The system is powered by a steam-driven pump that maintains pressure in the accumulator tank. As long as the pump is running and the tank is pressurized, the elevator should rise smoothly to any floor. The pressure required to lift the platform depends on the load. For a typical freight elevator in 1894, operating pressures ranged from 50 to 80 pounds per square inch. A 12-inch piston at 70 psi generates roughly 6,000 pounds of lifting force, more than enough to raise a 2,000-pound load plus the weight of the platform itself. Under normal conditions, the system is reliable. Hydraulic elevators of this type were installed in warehouses, factories, and hotels throughout the United States. They were considered safer than cable-driven elevators because there was no risk of freefall. If the pressure dropped, the platform would simply stop and settle gently. But this elevator wasn't failing in a typical way. It wasn't losing pressure. The gauges showed consistent readings. It wasn't leaking. There were no puddles, no drips, no wet spots on the packing glands. The piston wasn't jammed. The valves weren't stuck. The system was operating exactly as designed. And yet, somewhere between the fourth and fifth floors, the platform encountered resistance that shouldn't exist. Not a mechanical obstruction. Nothing physical was blocking the piston. But something in the fluid itself was preventing the platform from rising further. The engineers who arrived in December understood this. They knew the system was intact. They knew the problem had to be hydraulic, not mechanical. But hydraulic systems in 1894 were not well understood in the way they are today. Fluid dynamics, the science of how liquids behave under pressure, in motion, at varying temperatures, was still emerging. Engineers knew how to build pumps and pistons. They understood pressure and force. But the subtleties of compressibility, aeration, viscosity, and resonance were not yet part of standard practice. The elevator was operating within known principles. But it was also revealing something those principles didn't yet account for. The engineers were named Halford and Pittman. Halford was older, methodical, a man who'd spent 20 years designing industrial hydraulic systems. Pittman was younger, trained in thermodynamics, and had worked on steam engines before transitioning to hydraulics. They began by replicating the problem. On December 16th, they loaded the platform with 1,000 pounds of sandbags and sent it to the fifth floor. It stopped 9 feet short. They recorded the pressure reading, 71 psi. They lowered the platform, waited 30 minutes and tried again. This time it reached the top. They repeated the test over 3 days, varying the load, the time of day, and the number of prior lifts. What emerged was a pattern, faint but present. The elevator was more likely to stop short if it had been idle for more than 2 hours. The ambient temperature was below 55 degrees. Multiple lifts had been performed in rapid succession earlier in the day. Halford suspected the fluid. He drained a sample from the hydraulic chamber and examined it in a glass jar. The water was cloudy, not contaminated. There was no oil, no rust, no foreign material, but it wasn't clear. When he held the jar up to the light, he could see tiny bubbles suspended throughout the liquid. Aeration. Air had dissolved into the hydraulic fluid. This wasn't uncommon. Hydraulic systems often developed small amounts of entrained air over time, especially if the reservoir was exposed to temperature fluctuations or if the pump introduced turbulence during operation. But aerated fluid behaves differently than pure water. When compressed, air bubbles collapse. This makes the fluid slightly compressible, something that pure water, for most practical purposes, is not. Under normal conditions, this compressibility is negligible, but in a long vertical column, under sustained pressure, it can create unexpected effects. Pittman turned his attention to temperature. He measured the fluid temperature in the reservoir, 53 degrees. He measured it again in the hydraulic chamber after a lift, 58 degrees. The fluid was warming as it cycled through the system. Warmer fluid has lower viscosity. It flows more easily, but it also changes the way pressure distributes through the column. In a cold system, the fluid resists flow more strongly, causing pressure to build unevenly. In a warm system, the fluid moves more freely, but may develop flow instabilities. Pittman suspected something else as well: valve lag. The control valve that regulated flow into the hydraulic chamber was a simple gate valve, operated by a hand lever. When the operator opened the valve, water flowed from the accumulator into the chamber. But the valve didn't open instantly. It took a fraction of a second for the gate to move, for the flow to stabilize, for the pressure to equalize. Under sustained load, like lifting a heavy platform over 50 feet, the valve might not respond quickly enough to maintain steady pressure. If the platform slowed even slightly, the pressure would drop. If the pressure dropped, the flow would decrease. If the flow decreased, the pressure would drop further. A feedback loop. Halford and Pittman began constructing a theory. They couldn't prove it yet, not with the tools available in 1894, but the pieces were starting to fit. They built a test rig in the basement. It wasn't a full-scale replica, just a 12-foot section of pipe, a hand pump, and a pressure gauge. But it was enough to observe fluid behavior under controlled conditions. Halford filled the pipe with water from the hydraulic reservoir, the same aerated, slightly cloudy fluid. He sealed one end and attached the pump to the other. Then he began applying pressure. At first, everything behaved as expected. The pressure gauge climbed steadily, 20 psi, 40, 60. But as the pressure increased, Halford noticed something strange. The gauge needle began to flutter, not wildly, just a slight oscillation back and forth, as if the pressure inside the pipe was pulsing. He increased the pressure further. The flutter grew more pronounced. At 80 psi, the needle swung through a 5-pound range, rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed almost regular. Pittman recognized it immediately: resonance. In a long, rigid column of fluid, pressure waves can reflect off the closed end and travel back toward the source. If the frequency of these reflections matches the frequency of the pump strokes, the waves can reinforce each other, creating oscillations. In a hydraulic elevator, these oscillations would be invisible. There's no way to see pressure waves traveling through water, but their effects would be real. If the pressure oscillated even slightly, the lifting force on the piston would oscillate as well. The platform would slow, stop, and then, if the pressure recovered, resume climbing. But if the oscillation was strong enough, or if it coincided with other factors like aeration or temperature, the platform might stop entirely. Halford drained the test pipe and refilled it with fresh, deaerated water. This time, when he applied pressure, the gauge remained steady. No flutter, no oscillation. He repeated the test with cold water. The gauge showed a slight lag when pressure was first applied. The cold, viscous fluid resisted flow more strongly, but once the pressure stabilized, it held steady. He repeated the test with warm, aerated water. The oscillations returned. The engineers were beginning to understand. The problem wasn't a single failure. It was a combination of factors, each small on its own, but together creating a condition that the elevator's designers had never anticipated. Aeration reduced the effective pressure by making the fluid compressible. Temperature affected viscosity, which changed how quickly pressure could build. Valve lag introduced delays in flow response. And resonance, subtle, almost imperceptible, created oscillations that disrupted the lifting force. On some days, these factors aligned in a way that stopped the elevator short. On other days, they didn't. The elevator wasn't broken. It was trapped by the physics of the fluid itself. Calculations, fluid dynamics notes, and hand-drawn diagrams of the hydraulic system. The core explanation was this: the elevator operated at the edge of a pressure equilibrium. Under ideal conditions, pure water, stable temperature, steady flow, the system provided more than enough force to lift the platform to the 5th floor. But real conditions were never ideal. Air had dissolved into the hydraulic fluid over months of operation. This made the fluid slightly compressible. When the piston rose and pressure built in the long vertical column, the air bubbles were compressed, absorbing some of the applied force. The higher the piston rose, the more pressure was required to compress the air further. At the same time, the fluid's viscosity changed with temperature. On cold mornings, the fluid resisted flow, causing pressure to build unevenly. On warmer days or after multiple lifts, the fluid flowed more easily, but this also introduced turbulence, which disrupted the pressure distribution. The control valve responded with a slight lag. When the operator opened the valve, it took a fraction of a second for flow to stabilize. If the platform slowed, even slightly, the pressure dropped. If the pressure dropped, the flow decreased. If the flow decreased, the pressure dropped further. A feedback loop developed, starving the system of the pressure it needed to continue climbing. And finally, in the long column of fluid between the pump and the piston, pressure waves reflected back and forth, creating oscillations. These oscillations were small, probably undetectable to the operators. but they were enough to destabilize the lifting force at the top of the shaft, where the pressure margin was already thin. Together, these factors created a moving pressure ceiling. It wasn't a fixed height. It depended on the fluid temperature, the amount of dissolved air, the load weight, the valve timing, and the resonance frequency on that particular day. Some days the ceiling was 8 feet below the 5th floor. Some days it was 12 feet below. Some days it didn't exist at all. The engineers recommended 3 changes. Deaerate the hydraulic fluid by draining the system and refilling it slowly to minimize turbulence. Install a larger accumulator tank to provide more stable pressure during long lifts. Replace the hand-operated control valve with a pressure-compensated valve that could adjust flow automatically. The modifications were completed in February 1895. After that, the elevator reached the 5th floor consistently. But the incident remained in the engineering records. Halford's report was cited in later studies of hydraulic elevator design. Pittman published a paper on fluid compressibility in vertical columns, which became a reference text for industrial engineers in the early 1900s. The elevator itself continued operating until 1923, when the warehouse was demolished to make room for a rail expansion.